Good. Thank you, Chairperson. Good morning, honorable members, stakeholders, and colleagues. So far, we have in attendance, we have Mr. Dango, Mr. Khai, Mr. Moimang, Mr. Lont, and Ms. Moshodi, and Ms. Boshoff. And we also have a standing apology for Mr. Landsman and an apology for Mama Rekhane. In our meeting, we also have the state law advisors, the parliamentary legal advisors. We also have Dr. Clark, our content advisor, and Mr. Bazir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. Maybe I must also inform the committee that Supega Toleni, the committee, is not well, and that colleagues are in for him. And let's appreciate the work that you are doing, Grace, in terms of coming to our rescue. Can we then flag the let's know this and also know the attendees, and then let's flag the program.
Recording in progress.
That's the program for the day. I've already extended a word of welcome to all of you and also open the meeting. And then the next item will be the overview. Then it will be the oral submission by both the Medical Research Council, Mental Health and Tobacco Research Unit, and then also the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and then that will be followed by the presentation from I believe the parliamentary legal team led by Ms. P. Ngema, and then again overview by Dr. Clark on the written submissions, then the presentation by Salga, which will be led by Mr. Tolinci, and then that's where we are, and then we'll then deal with the minutes. That's the agenda for the day, honorable members. Let me take that the agenda is adopted, and then without any waste of time, give over to the content advisor to chart to lead the charge. Over to you, content advisor.
Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chairperson and members. So the first bill that we are going to be dealing with is the, let me just get it correct. Can members see my presentation on full screen?
It's not on full.
You can see the first page, but it is showing. You must just sort it on your side.
Yes.
There we go.
Great. Yeah, you can hit the ground running, Doc.
Thank you, Chairperson. The first bill we're going to be dealing with is the National Transport Road Transport Amendment Bill. The bill was passed in the National Assembly and transmitted to the NCP for concurrence and referred to the Select Committee on 27 September 2022. The Department of Transport briefed the committee on the bill on 15 March 2023, and on 26 March, the bill was placed in national media according for written submissions with a deadline of 24 April 2023. The committee.
Doc, just clarity. Did you
Yes?
say the Transport Bill or the National Road Traffic Amendment Bill? I just need to get clarity on that.
Sorry, it's the Road Traffic Amendment Bill, Chair.
Yeah, no, that's great. You can proceed.
The committee will today hear oral submissions on the bill, and on the 14th of June 2023, the department will return to the committee, Chair, to provide the responses on the bill. So my role for this morning, Chair, is to take the committee through written submissions that were received for the persons who are not going to be doing oral submissions before the committee today. And then the department's role at the 14th of June will be to respond to those submissions. Just a brief reminder of the objects of the bill, Chairperson and members. It's to amend the National Road Traffic Act, to provide for the suspension and cancellation of the registration of an examiner for driver's licenses or an examiner of vehicles, if such person has been convicted of an offence listed in the Criminal Procedures Act, specifically Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. To provide for the registration and grading of training centres, to provide for the registration of manufacturers, builders, bodybuilders, importers and manufacturers of number plates, including manufacturers of reflective sheeting for number plates, embossers of number plates, weighbridge facilities, manufacturers of microdots, and suppliers of microdots and microdot fitment centres. It also extends the right to appeal to the above listed entities and bodies. The further objectives are to require the provincial department responsible for land, for transport or local authority to register driving license testing centres. It provides for the appointment of inspectors of manufacturers and those listed entities. It prohibits the use of unauthorized aid during a test for learner's license or a driving license test and the disqualification thereof. It provides for the registration and grading of driving school instructors and driving schools. And it also regulates further on international driving permits and foreign driving license and permits, and matters incidental thereto. So inputs were received, Chairperson, from the and committee members from general public via email, the Amajube Driving School Association in Newcastle, KZN, the Western Cape Department of Mobility, the South African Local Government Association, the South African Driving School Operators Association, the Medical Research Council, and the Congress of South African Trade Unionists, Chair. The last two presenters are here with the committee today to do their oral submissions. So if you're looking at this is only the email submissions, Honourable Committee. On the question, do you support the bill? Yes, was 6% of persons, that's about 38 of the 660 email submissions said yes. 18%, that's 118 submissions said we partially support the bill. And 76%, that's 504 of the email submissions said no, we object to the bill, Chair. A lot of the objections are related to clause 40 of the bill, which we will deal with going a bit lower, Chair. And Chair, with the email submissions, a lot of the submissions would say I object to the bill, but not necessarily to the detail that one is able to discern what the actual root cause of the objections are, Chairperson. But nonetheless, those written submissions will still be, those email submissions, Chair, is also part of the submissions that the department will come and respond to on the 14th. So if you look at the breakdown of the comments on the clauses, like I said, a lot of the objections was related to clause 40, which is essentially the limitation of liability of persons who are responding to disaster management incidences, but I'll deal with that just a bit lower down. 42% of the inputs related to the objects of the bill, which is an option people use when they want to, as it says, object to the broader objects and not a specific clause necessarily. So if I go into a bit of a detail about the actual submissions received, there was some support from the bill, especially the view that the bill will address a number of loopholes. The first one being that it will introduce accountability on how driving schools operate, and the sense that there's really been predators operating within the sector in the absence of such accountability that have cheated the public, and in one person's words, actually forced the public into buying a driving license. Other reasons for supporting the bill is that it will reduce crime and contribute to addressing job scarcity in the country, as the view is that it will create more business opportunities for persons to take part of. And then in general, any effort to bring about more accountability and less corruption should be supported. That's the views for supporting the bill, Chairperson. When you go to the various clauses, Chair, that most people commented on. An earlier version of the bill, that was B720, when it was introduced, Chair, prohibited any amount of concentration of alcohol in a specimen of blood or specimen of breath taken from any driver in order to enhance road safety. The version of the bill that is before us now, Chairperson, no longer contains that prohibition. So we have received submissions from people, Chair, who are petitioning the committee to, even if it's not to return to a 0% concentration, to consider a reduction in the blood alcohol level that is permissible. So both Basata, for example, and Prof. Perry, who's with us today, are going to be touching on that in their submissions. There's a concern that when institutions such as the Road Traffic Management Act is subject to provisions from a number of legislation, that this can create confusion. There's also a sense that if the existing legislation is properly enforced, corruption will be eradicated and the new bill would not be necessary. In respect of the registration of officers, Chairperson, registration and grading of officers, there's a view, Chair, that the category of spouse or partner is not the only relationship through which a financial interest can be obtained, and that the draft amendment should be broadened to include other persons known or connected to the examiner. In respect of clause 5, the cancellation or suspension of registration of officers, the question was posed why only persons who were convicted of Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 offences in the Criminal Act are prohibited, and why not the other schedules in the Act as well. Clause 9, when it comes to the registration of manufacturers, builders, importers, and manufacturers of number plates. The inputs was that the number plates are no longer administered by the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, and that this has caused a huge challenge in the enforcement of the regulation of number plates. And that the committee must also consider to widen the scope for approval and monitoring of imposters. In respect of the registration of driving license centres, given that only a provincial department responsible for transport or municipality may operate a driving license testing centre, clarity is sought on the future of driving license testing centres that are intended to be operated by national state departments such as SAPS and the South African National Defence Force. And clarity is requested in the respect of the rationale for not including national departments. The inputs from the industry in respect of the application of an issue of driving license, the bill makes provision for the driving test centers to provide a motor vehicle for a person doing the test. And the view from industry is that these driving license test centers authorities would then be directly competing with driving schools and driving school businesses, which will be negatively affected. And they view this as essentially being unfair competition that is being created. So clause 40, Chair, you will recall that, and members, this is where a lot of the email submissions objected to the bill too. So clause 40 provides that any vehicle driven by a person responding to a disaster, as contemplated in the Disaster Management Act, may disregard the directions of a road traffic sign, which is displayed in a prescribed manner. There's a very strong sense that this provision is open for potential abuse and creates a safety risk on the roads. The views that it will result in reckless driving, accidents and death, may create loopholes for abuse by a number of the persons referred to as blue light brigades, transporting ministers and office bearers, and that the definition of disaster needs to be clear to avoid abuse of the clause. And furthermore, that caution must still apply, and such people should be given advanced or defensive driving training as well as a permit to present to police if stopped. Okay, so that was essentially the clauses that received the most amount of attention during the submissions. We will hear further detail from COSATU and Prof. Periche, and on the 14th, the department will return to the committee with a detailed overview of their response to the submissions received. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Doc, for taking us through the written submissions that were made, and the approach is that let's members note any clarity-seeking questions that they want to raise in regard to the presentations made, and then move to the next item, which will be the oral submission by the Medical Research Council, which will be led by Professor Perry. I see the hand of Honorable Lunt. Honorable Lunt.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a short note, but I did like that one slide giving the breakdown of the submissions received, the quantities, the percentages, and Honorable Khai is online as well, and some of the other stuff, but that is something going forward as well, that we have that quantitative measure as well. Obviously, the content thereof, we can then debate, but that is, I want to say thanks for that, and also going forward, because that gives a nice, quick overview of what's going on, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Lunt, for that comment. Let's then, if Professor Perry is ready, she can ascend to the platform. Professor
Thank you very
Perry.
much. Thank you.
Welcome, Prof.
Good morning, honorable members. Can I present my slides? Is it possible to show it somehow? Or I did send them through. Could someone else put them up?
I suggest that they give you hosting rights so that you can run the presentation from your side, Prof.
Okay. I put them up. Let me know if you can see them. Thank you.
Thank you. We can see them. Over to you.
Thank you. Great. I think I have about 12 slides. It's not too many. So I'm going to be commenting, and particularly, as was mentioned, referring to the reduction of blood alcohol levels permissible in drivers, which was removed from a previous version of this bill, I believe by the Assembly. And I'm calling for the reinstatement of that at a slightly different level, as was said by by Dr. Clark. So I'm just moving my slide down. So I'm going to be covering these points very briefly, my credentials, then my main proposal, talk about public support for lower levels of blood alcohol concentration, experience from other countries that have lowered blood alcohol concentration levels, then summarize that experience and the impact of increasing BAC levels on deaths, and then some key recommendations and some concluding comments, very briefly. So I really won't go into much detail here. You can read some of my credentials. I'm the director of the Mental Health, Alcohol, Substance Use and Tobacco Research Unit at the MRC since 2021. I'm a professor in psychiatry at Stellenbosch University, registered psychologist, published over 300 articles in the substance abuse field, mainly alcohol, been working with the WHO, a member of the Global Alcohol Policy Alliance, and worked extensively in South Africa at local government, provincial and national government around alcohol policy in different government departments. So my main suggestion is to recommend, basically, going beyond suggesting, that the National Council of Provinces refer the bill back to the other house to have the provisions of the original bill indicating a lowering of the allowable concentration of maximum allowable concentration of alcohol in the blood of ordinary drivers, which was proposed to be go down to 0 alcohol in the blood, to lower it to 0.02 to allow for detecting minimal amounts of alcohol from, for example, medicines. But on various objections or various inputs, that committee decided to take these provisions out. And I'm going to basically recommending that they be reinstated. So basically, I'm strongly in favor of decreasing permissible blood alcohol concentration levels from the current 0.05 to reduce the heavy burden associated by South Africa in terms of loss of life, injury, damage to property, and economic costs, which I won't go into. This will take the guesswork out of drivers having to estimate whether they're under the current 0.05 threshold. Basically, we're separating drinking and driving. This will send out a message that drinking and driving don't go together. However, from a practical point of view, my written submission indicates that we should consider making the maximum level 0.02 or only taking action when that threshold is exceeded. And I'll go into more details on that. So on the left is a publication that I co-authored, but what came out of it was a representative household survey of almost 2,000 adult drinkers in Tshwane, conducted by my unit in 2014, found that over half supported or strongly supported lowering allowable blood alcohol concentrations for drivers. They felt the 0.05 level should be reduced. A further 17 said they were neutral, and only 28% said they were opposed to lowering BAC levels. So this is of drinkers in Tshwane, a representative sample. If we did bring our level down, it would bring us in line with 23 other countries around the world, including Brazil, we're part of BRICS, and there are 12 other countries with BAC levels at 0.02, also including China, which is a member of BRICS, Sweden and Norway, for example. I'm just going to refer to country data. We'll first refer to Brazil. In June 2008, they dropped the permissible blood alcohol concentration in drivers to 0.02, which is what I'm recommending for South Africa. And in an article published in Addiction, they did a time series analysis to study the effect of the legislative change of dropping that BAC level in both the state of Brazil and the capital city of Sao Paulo to investigate traffic injuries and fatalities on a monthly basis over just over a 10.5-year period. And the new traffic law of reducing it to 0.02 was responsible for significant reductions in traffic injuries and fatalities in both the state and the city of Sao Paulo. A stronger effect was observed for traffic fatalities, a minus 7.2% drop in traffic deaths in the state, and a minus 16% drop in traffic-related deaths in the capital. And then an article in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization said that since the law was implemented, the Ministry of Health data from Brazil shows a 32% drop in road deaths in Rio de Janeiro state, compared to a decline in only 6.2% in states where they haven't enforced the dry law. So they didn't all enforce it equally. So certainly some benefit in dropping the 2.02. In Japan and Sweden, in Japan, permissible BAC levels were changed to 0.03 in 2002, and research has shown a reduction in all alcohol-related and non-alcohol-related traffic injuries since that law was imposed. And in Sweden, dropping the level to 0.02 in 1990 reduced fatal crashes by 6%. And finally, the USA and Australia. In the USA, some states have zero tolerance laws for young or novice drivers. Zero tolerance means no alcohol is permitted while you're driving. And the first 12 states to enact this legislation found a 20% reduction in single vehicle nighttime fatal crashes amongst drivers under 21 years of age, compared to control states which didn't implement such a zero tolerance for young drivers. And a later international study found a 24% decrease in the number of young drivers with positive BAC laws as a result of zero tolerance laws. And then a review of research in Australia and the US found reductions between 9% and 24% in fatal crashes associated with the implementation of zero tolerance laws for young people. So certainly some quite very substantial effects of reducing the levels to 0.02 or 0.03, and then or to zero in novice drivers provided in this review. So what's the summary of the experience? In a nutshell, depending on which study you're looking at, reductions between 6% and 32% in fatal crashes have been obtained by reducing BAC levels to 0.02, 0.03, or even going as far as zero. Basically, when you look at the impact of alcohol on people's functioning, a study done by the a UK group called the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence found that drivers with a BAC of 0.02 to 0.05, which is the area we're talking about changing the legislation for, have more than 3 times greater risk for dying in a vehicle crash compared to persons with no alcohol in their blood. And the risk increases to more than 6 times if you go above 0.05 to 0.08 and so forth. But we're not looking at that particularly in the legislation. We already have a 0.05 level, which could be better enforced. So my key recommendations, I think this is my last 2 slides, deal with what level we should have, the issue of different sanctions depending on where you get where your alcohol level is found, and the importance of other interventions, and the issue of mandatory testing at crash sites. And I'm not sure if this committee can look into all of these, but I certainly would just like to make these points. Given the possibility of blood alcohol concentration tests being positive as a result of drivers consuming medications containing alcohol or small trace amounts from drinking even 12 hours previously, my recommendation in the MRCs is that the threshold for taking punitive action be 0.02. So we drop the level back to where it was in the version 7 of the bill from 2020. Brazil has done this. They've considered differentiating between drivers who've a blood alcohol concentration between 0.02 and 0.06, and those above 0.06, at 0.06 or above. And the first group are dealt with administratively. They get a fine, whereas those with blood alcohol concentrations in Brazil over 0.06 or go to the criminal court. And I think that's something we should really consider. I know the AA, the Automobile Association, was concerned with increasing criminalization of drivers if we drop the BAC level. And that was their major objection to dropping it between 0.05. But I think we could deal with that by only having fines or administrative sanctions for people who are found to have blood alcohol levels between 0.02 and 0.05. That'll reduce the burden on the police, the courts, and prevent people from being criminalized for levels between 0.02 and 0.05, but we'll still get the benefit of reducing BAC levels in terms of reducing deaths, harms, and economic costs. So I undertook in 2019 an umbrella review of systematic reviews of alcohol control interventions, which suggests that reducing BAC limits alone may not be as successful if they're not combined with other interventions, such as increasing police controls, increasing testing, things like mandatory ignition locks, where someone who's previously been found to be driving over the limit, then the court mandates that they have something called an interlock put on their car, so that you have to blow into this machine. It tests your blood alcohol levels, and only if you're below a certain level will it allow the car to start. So the recommendation is, if we drop the blood alcohol level to 0.02, we institute things like mandatory interlocks for people who've been previously tested, and we increase police patrols, increase things like awareness campaigns, as well as dropping the blood alcohol level. And then the other point, which I think is a no-brainer, is to consider mandatory alcohol testing of drivers at all serious motor vehicle crash sites, where someone is seriously injured, killed, or where there's serious damage to property. I think we need to know the alcohol burden, and we need to use that in sanctions against people who are taken to court in such instances. Finally, sorry, my last slide, oops, is this one here, and I'm going to put up my, sorry, you can't see my last slide, can you? I'm going to put it back. Okay, now, can you see it?
Yes.
Thank you. My last slide is that going ahead with this approach to drop the maximum blood alcohol concentration to 0.02 would send out a clear message that drinking and driving don't go together. It would affect many of us. I mean, I consume alcohol. I would just then basically not be able to drink and drive. I'd have to find alternative transport or get someone else to drive me. It would address concerns about drivers being caught with small amounts of alcohol from medicines. It would also address the issue of criminalizing people, because we wouldn't criminalize people between 0.02 and 0.05. But the impact would be only meaningful if there was a commitment to enforcement and ensuring adequate mechanisms to ensure that testing equipment is available and properly calibrated. And I think, finally, not taking the opportunity, it's really before your committee, otherwise I think it's dead in the water, not taking this opportunity to reduce maximum BAC levels for drivers will be a missed opportunity to have an impact on the approximately 14,000 road deaths a year, where it's been said that almost 60% of all collisions on our roads can be attributable to alcohol. And where even Arrive Alive has reported that half the people who die on our roads have blood alcohol levels above the legal limit of 0.05. So I think it's before your committee to decide if they really want to take this opportunity to make this impact and have an impact on reducing alcohol-related harm on our roads and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for the taking us through the overview of our presentation. We really appreciated the thrust of the presentation, the scanning over the global picture in terms of what is the situation in relation to blood alcohol level, the key recommendations, the approach, and then the recommendations that we are making. We appreciate that. I just need to check, because we had agreed that we need to take all the presentation and then allow members to simply screen question. Is Prof comfortable with that? You don't have any other pressure?
That's fine. I can stay on until 10:40 easily. Or yeah.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Then let's then agree to then take another presentation from Pusatu. Parks.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning to members. Yeah, we can start with our presentation. Still allow me to upload it quickly.
Welcome, Parks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks, Chair, for giving us a space, Cosatu, just to share our views on what we think is a very critical bill for society, for workers, for the economy, for the state, etc. I think, Chair, it's also been quite beneficial to hear the input of the MRC And I think their kind of expertise is quite valuable. And I think that we have a lot of synergy with the issues they have raised. And I think we're better off having listened to them as well. So, Chair, yeah, also let me just say great members and great colleagues from Parliament and from government. So I think, Chair, for us as a bill, we had engaged on it at NEDLAC a few years ago, as well as at the National Assembly. And our premise is guided by the fact that we lose about 14,000 deaths every year on road accidents, be it drivers, passengers, pedestrians, and so forth. And this is obviously very painful, but also equally a very needless loss for those families. Children lose parents, breadwinners. This threatens the survival of these families economically when they lose breadwinners. There's a huge cost to them in terms of medical costs and so forth. It costs the economy billions of rands in lost wages and productivity and so forth. There's a huge burden to the fiscus. We have the Road Accident Fund, which is mired with issues of corruption and mismanagement and so forth. But it also has liabilities which have now exceeded about 400 billion rand. And as a consequence, you then find part of the taxes for the fuel price regime goes to the road levy, which funds the RAF. I think we all know, as many instances of traffic testing centers, traffic officers, and allegations of corruption. So we support this bill, Chair. We think it's long overdue, it's progressive, it's necessary. So we have two areas of concern around it. I think the first one, which we agree really with the MRC's input, and I think we really welcome it. So for us, Chair, we're really appalled by the abuse of alcohol in society. We think about 25% of road accidents, whether it's pedestrians or drivers or passengers, is as a result of the abuse of alcohol. We think that clearly the existing limits and enforcement are clearly not sufficient. There's too much ambiguity around the current blood alcohol level, in terms of your weight, your age, your type of alcohol, etc. We think also there's a need for law to be ruthlessly enforced, especially for young people and for professional drivers. And I think some of the examples mentioned by the MRC internationally are also quite useful. So we were supporting this bill, in particular the clause removing any content from alcohol, from the blood of alcohol. We were really quite dismayed by the National Assembly's deletion of the clause 46. We understand the issue of medication and so forth. That's fine, but clearly the system right now is broken. We can't be content as a society when every single year we see about 14,000 deaths on the roads. And again, alcohol is a key part of it. I think we saw during COVID-19 the positive effects when we actually began to take this crisis of alcohol abuse seriously. So I think, Chair, our proposal on this front on the issue of drinking and driving is to reinsert clause 46 to deal with the issue of the current levels of alcohol in our blood. So we had originally proposed, Chair, that this simply reinstates that clause of no alcohol in your blood content. But having just listened now to the MRC, if the committee was to say, let's go take the MRC's proposal of 0.02, we would think that would equally do the job and would equally be a very progressive solution, Chair. So I think for us, but we can't simply say the status quo is acceptable. And there are acceptable, positive examples we could look at internationally, for example, like Sweden and so forth, which has also taken a zero tolerance approach and has had very positive consequences to it. Chair, just on the issue of the regulation and the requirements for traffic schools, we think the provisions are positive. They provide a clear criteria and conditions for driver education schools, which is needed. They provide positive standards for driving instructors and empowering government to deal with the issue of offending schools. And I think we all know many stories about schools which are corrupt, which have an unhealthy relationship with testing centers. We need to make sure that we teach learners properly, and we need to deal with the issue of collusion with corrupt officials. And I think we all know this is one of the reasons why we have a huge number of reckless drivers on our roads. And again, this is a public safety risk. So we support these provisions on the schools, and we think the enforcement must also be equally efficient as well, given that lives are at risk. Chair, on the issue of the business interest for traffic officials, we support those. This is a problem throughout the state and in fact throughout society, where we have really a cancer of corruption into every fabric of our lives, and our moral ethics are being eroded. So we support the provisions providing for a prohibition for traffic officials, vehicle and licensing officials from having business or financial interest in the sector. We know it's not going to be easy to enforce, but I think it's the right message and it's the right step forward. We simply can't afford officials to report financial conflicts of interest, and this is a necessary anti-corruption provision. And again, it needs to be enforced. Chair, I think if you look at the issue of impounding or unroadworthy vehicles, I think we know the conditions on the roads in our townships and rural areas in particular, where we see many, many vehicles which are just blatantly unroadworthy. And again, Chair, we see often reckless drivers continue to be allowed to drive these. So I think we want to welcome the provisions allowing traffic officials to be empowered to impound these vehicles as necessary, especially on serious transgressions. And of course, you just must make sure that these are not abused by traffic officials to extort bribes. So there must be some measures in regulations and management to prevent corruption and so forth. On the licensing plate manufacturing, again, this is a public security issue. We have huge problems of illegal vehicles being stolen and transported illegally to neighboring states, especially Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So the manufacturing license plates, we agree, needs to be strictly regulated and enforced. Again, poor quality license plates also makes it difficult to enforce traffic laws. The issue of fake and duplicate stolen license plates is a real problem. So I think we want to welcome the provisions to tightly manage the sector. And so we support these provisions as necessary and long overdue. Chair, again, on the issue of weighbridges, I mean, this has been a significant public safety issue. It's been a significant risk to truck drivers. So we do welcome the provisions for a much tighter regulation and oversight of the weighbridges. Often we've seen the quality testing very lackluster or poor, often riddled with corruption and asking for bribes from drivers. And again, Chair, this poses a risk to the lives of those drivers and of course to all road users. And again, has an impact upon the deterioration of our roads prematurely, and again, a significant cost to lives, state, and the economy. The driver's cancellation issue is not a light issue, Chair, and it must be handled quite sensitively. We need to make sure it's not abused for caution, etc. But we think the measures provided for are fair. They take the right balance. Including, for example, on the issue of no longer being able to physically drive. Those are long overdue, and it's strange we haven't had them before. So I think, Chair, just the specific conditions we think they need to find space in the regulations is around the issues of appeals, for example, because you do want to avoid unintended consequences where workers who depend upon having driver's licenses to travel or to perform their work, etc., to retain their jobs, must have some sort of mechanisms which are fair and accessible for appeals where relevant. And of course, we should make sure there are mechanisms of management to avoid any elements of corruption that's seeping in. Chair, again, the issue of the provisions for the learners and driving testing, they're quite strict. And again, we think they're long overdue. They're straightforward, they're common sense. And again, they speak to a situation where we have corruption at driving testing centers and so forth. And again, the society pays a consequence when you have people who are simply not properly trained and who are now driving on the roads. We think there's a similar need, again, Chair, around the PDPs. Provisions are straightforward and common sense. We do need to make sure the regulations are reviewed and overhauled because we think at times we have been a little bit cavalier, where often it's easier to get PDPs than normal driving licenses. Chair, we think it needs to be a bit stricter because you're not just driving yourself or your immediate passengers, but you're driving a large amount of commuters and so forth. And we often, I think we've seen, Chair, people who drive buses, for example, driving in a very reckless manner. And this poses a risk to the passengers, to society at large. So we need to see in the regulations a much stricter approach to the testing for PDPs. Chair, I think, Dr. Clark, I think, gave a useful kind of summary of the emergency vehicle provisions. We welcome the provisions. Our concern, Chair, there really was around our members who are from POPCRU, who are members of the SAPS VIP Protection Unit. Chair, I think we've often seen political office bearers die unnecessarily and with the drivers with them because of speeding. Chair, we all remember painfully the issue of Collins Chibane, Molifi Sefolaro, I think even recently, the MEC Tati Magwe, many others who have died unnecessarily because of driving. Often the issue of speeding dangerous driving has been involved. We often have had complaints from our members who are officers in the VIP protection unit who are saying that, look, we are told by politicians who must drive at 160 to get to whatever meeting they're late to. And we don't think that should be allowed. We always express platitudes when these members die, but nothing is done afterwards. Chair, we think we need to set up a stronger example and amend the provisions on emergency vehicles with an additional subclause which simply says that this excludes SAPS VIP members, driving politicians or whomever, and who are not responding to an actual emergency. They should not be exempt from the traffic laws, from the speeding regulations, etc. Yes, you would want, for example, the protectors of a president, if his life is in danger, to be allowed. But if a minister or MEC is simply traveling to a branch meeting, wherever, and they're late, that should not constitute an emergency, and they shouldn't then be exempt. Chair, just on the issue, getting towards the end, on the issue of the import exemptions, we think the provisions, allowing a person to apply for exemptions to the minister for vehicles not meeting our road requirements are a little bit vague, and perhaps in the regulations, the conditions for those exemptions should be specified. They shouldn't infringe upon around road safety of a vehicle or passengers or undermine environmental laws. So you don't want dumping of vehicles that don't meet our laws in the country, but we also don't want to see a minister be giving a blank check. What's in the check, because the motor manufacturing industry is a huge part of our economy. We've often seen companies from overseas wanting to dump vehicles here and undermine our efforts to grow and to support this critical and strategic sector of the economy. So, Chair, just in conclusion, we support this progressive bill. We think it's long overdue. It should be passed by Parliament, enacted by the President and so forth timelessly, and of course implemented by the state. We really want to oppose the lobbying by the liquor industry, which we think is simply fixated on profits from liquor sales at the expense of saving lives. So we want to see how can we strengthen the bill's progressive provisions. We had wanted to see clause 46 deal with the issue of alcohol and blood content levels being reinserted. We had wanted to go to the 0 level, but we'd also support the call for the MRC for 0.02. We really want to urge the NCP to take that on board. And of course, a clause protecting SAPS VIP officers from having to break speed limits and traffic laws in non-emergencies. But Chair, having said this, you can pass this, Parliament will pass this progressive law, but we do need to see the states then, national, provincial, so forth, local, having public education campaigns to make sure officials are aware, road users are aware of their legal obligations. We also see government beginning to take road safety much more seriously and to invest in the capacitation and the resourcing of road traffic enforcement. We have many municipalities, about 27 municipalities right now, which are no longer able to pay their staff members. So we really need to see a much more pragmatic approach to how we resource the public service and the local government. But we think the lackadaisical approach currently of government is really unnecessarily condemning thousands to premature deaths and causing the economy billions of rands. So let me stop there, Chair, and apologies if I went over my time limit slightly. But thanks very much to members, Chair.
Thank you, Hans, for for taking us through the presentation on behalf of SATU. Like as I did indicate, what we will then do, we'll then request honorable members to raise any clarity-seeking question that they have in relation to the presentations. I've seen Honorable Dango, I've seen Honorable Lord, I've seen Honorable Khai, I've seen Honorable Borshoff. Let's move in that fashion. Honorable Khai, Honorable Dango.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chairperson, I think we need to welcome the presentations, particularly the one from COSATU, which actually was very, very pointed and made some very positive recommendations. Having said that, I think the issue of the blood alcohol level at 0.2% should be supported at this particular point in time. Chairperson, I have another question. The question of blue lights that was raised by COSATU. I noticed that private security companies are now using blue lights. Is this permissible? or should that not be prohibited? Because it's confusing policing and law enforcement duties with what private security companies are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Dango. Honorable Lord.
Thank you, Chair. Just a bit of tongue in check, Honorable Dango. Nobody is actually supposed to use it, especially politicians, because it's getting abused, and that's probably why there was such massive pushback on that one section. But what I do fully agree with is the enforcement capabilities, and that is a big thing, Chair, that we can actually advocate. Maybe even say, listen, get devolution to capable municipalities and provinces, more powers to them. So that is something that we must talk to possibly. But there's on the first presentation, there's a question that just popped up, and I don't know if the professor has the answer on that, but the percentages that he touched on about the fatalities of drunk driving, is that just drunk driving or drunk drivers, or does that include jaywalking? Because that's also a massive problem. And then people that get intoxicated and get involved in accidents. So I just want to find out, does that affect his stats, or did he bring that into consideration? But on the two, I do appreciate the input. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Lord. Honorable Khai.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Good morning to you, honorable members, and the staff of the Committee on Parliament, as well as our stakeholders. Now, I just want to find out my question is directed to COSATU as to whether the bill has been at NEDLAC, and also the second question, whether there has been any socio-economic impact assessment that was done on the bill. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Khai. Honorable Boshoff.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to everybody. I'd just like to know, we speak about the alcohol levels being dropped, which I agree with, but I'd just like to know how we're going to differentiate between medication and alcohol levels, because you can be stopped and you could have taken some medication, and then you have a record against your name because it has now been determined that your alcohol level is above the threshold. So if I could just be given an answer to that, thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Boshoff. Just from my side, the first one relates to Professor Perry, the household survey that was done in Tshwane in 2014, whether the survey was able to make a breakdown between the young people and the elders, or it was just a random survey used, irrespective as to making a distinction between the young drivers and the elders that are driving, and then the second one, I see the comparative analysis done only relates to countries outside Africa. Is there any reason, or is there any information that we have that could share light to us in relation to what is the situation in relation to the blood alcohol level in African countries? Other than that, let's then give over to Professor Perry to respond, and then we'll then give over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member. Okay, let me respond. There are, I think, about 3 or 4 questions that I can deal with quite quickly. The one question from Honourable Lant about whether the information on reductions in fatalities or effects on injuries was everybody or just drivers. Whenever I gave the information and I didn't say drivers, it relates to everybody. So it was reduction in fatalities on the road of people who died on the road, whether they were a pedestrian, a passenger, or a driver. But in some cases, I did refer specifically to drivers, but otherwise it was to all road users. The other issue of Honourable Boshoff about medication, I think, is a good issue, which people are concerned about. Many of us take medication sometimes, and sometimes there is a bit of alcohol in it. So that's why we make the recommendation to not basically take action against anybody with alcohol levels below 0.02, which would really generally pretty much cover those people who are taking medications, unless they are just drinking bottle after bottle of Fenzadrol, which would be abusive medication. So generally you wouldn't test above 0.02 for taking a medication, or if you have a single chocolate with some alcohol in it. But we are also mindful that we don't want to criminalize people for very low levels of alcohol. So that's why the recommendation was that there wouldn't be any record, basically, or criminal record on anybody who would be prosecuted for an offence for drinking for an alcohol level between 0.02 and 0.05. It would be like a road traffic fine. Many of us on occasion get speeding fines, and we don't have a criminal record for that, but we pay a fine and we hopefully learn our lesson and drive more carefully on roads. The question from the chair about young people, the Tshwane survey, we looked at people 15 and older. We do have the information on those between 15 and 18, but I don't have it at hand. I'd have to reanalyze the data to see if young people specifically were less opposed, for example, to, because I said that 55% of this representative survey, it was a very big survey of about 2,000 people, whether the young people differed, and I'd have to go back into that data. But I suspect that young people might have been, it probably may have been slightly less than 55% supporting it. We certainly found I think it was increasing excise taxes on alcohol, the young people were less supportive of the policy reforms. As regards your point about countries outside of Africa, unfortunately, that's a problem with much research when we look at the effect of interventions. A lot of it is done in countries in the north or in Australia. And there is, as I said, there's research from Brazil, and so often we have to look to Brazil. But this is an issue. I was, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was at World Health Organization. I was a trainer at a World Health Organization meeting on road safety, which included a section on alcohol. And the countries there was Ghana, Ethiopia, Ghana, Uganda, and Kenya. And there's not great data, but it's certainly something I recommended very strongly when I gave my presentations. We've got to measure what we're doing, because we can't measure it. We can't really to change if you're not showing that you're having an impact. Thank you.
Maybe just the last one before I give over to Cosatu. The rationale behind behind reverting back to 0.05, what could be the reasons? I think you could be able to share just in terms of probably what could also have led to to Parliament to set the level at 0.05. Any science information on that?
I haven't got hard data on that, and also maybe my colleague from COSATU would be willing to comment on that. But certainly when I look at the concerns of the Automobile Association, the issue was they didn't want their members stopped and criminalized, pestered by police. But, I don't, as I said, if you dropped it to 0.02 and you only had criminal sanctions above 0.05, you wouldn't be criminalizing people. We don't feel criminalized when we get caught for speeding. It's something we need to it's like a slap on the wrist, and we need to sort it out and it's a harsh sentence. So I think we can address that concern by the only having administrative sanctions. I suspect, as Matthews Park said, there was a lot of lobbying by the liquor industry and the liquor retailers, because they feel that, and we had the same when there was bans on tobacco smoking in bars. The establishments felt that they would lose a lot of business. But I think we have to weigh it up that driving on our roads is a privilege, and we have a huge burden in terms of alcohol-related offences. And certainly, I think they're more concerned about making profits than about the health and welfare of the people of the country. So I think there are ways around it. We need to improve public transport. We need to have designated drivers. But I think we can't go on with the current situation. As for other reasons, I think another reason that's often given is that enforcement of the 0.05 level is not done very well. So why would we want to drop it to 0.02? But it's like saying, well, maybe we shouldn't stop people at the roads because there will be corruption and police officers might want bribes. We have to address those problems as separate issues. They're not the same issue. We need to increase enforcement, random breath testing. It has happened in certain provinces at certain times, and it in the Western Cape, for example, many years back, there was a lot more aggressive policing of drink driving regulations, and I think we saw a reduction of road traffic collisions in that at that time. So enforcement, we shouldn't say that bad enforcement is a reason that we're not going to lower the BAC level.
Thank you, Prof, for that response. Okay, let's give over to Matthew Parks.
Thanks, Chen. Thanks to other members for the questions. And I think it's always very positive in the NCOP when you see members across political party line. I think having consensus on the key issues facing us. And I think for us, that is exactly what it is. Traffic is a huge crisis for all of us. So, Chair, I think just on the issues, other on the blood alcohol content, I mean, I think most members raised it. I think we have a choice. We can be content with the status quo. 14,000 deaths on the road, about a quarter or higher, be it road or be it pedestrian or passengers linked to alcohol abuse. And then it's fine. Then we can be content with that. We can be content with a road accident fund liabilities of 400 billion rand, the cost to families, the economy, to businesses, etc. But I think most of us, and I think members are positive in the responses, most members, I think, are not content with it. So I think, Chair, that's why for us, we thought the status quo isn't working. We want to see, we had hoped to see the existing, the previous clause being reduced to zero content, but we do take a medication issue. And I think the comments from Prof. Perry are helpful from the MRC perspective, that it is a fair compromise could be a 0.02% that can address, I think, Honorable Bossoff's concern about the medication issue, to avoiding people who simply took Panado or whatever medication, etc. And I think that, Prof. Perry, I think, is coming with a very interesting, nuanced approach to say, have a three-pronged approach or legal regime, so to speak, that people who have, below 0.02% alcohol content in the blood, that's fine, there's no problem. If you have, between 0.02 and 0.05, for example, you could be dealt with administrative, like a fine, like a traffic fine, etc. So it's not a criminal issue. But then those who are clearly having above 0.05, then we need to look at a more stricter regime. I think, Chair, for us, that's a positive, a nuanced, a pragmatic approach. But I think, Chair, for us, the bottom line is that the status quo has a heavy cost to families, to society, to the economy, to the fiscus. I think, Chair, for us, the National Assembly made a mistake, with the greatest of respect to the members there, to simply repeal that clause. They should have rather looked at a fairer compromise like the MRC is proposing. And yes, Chair, members are right to say we must also capacitate the state around enforcement. But it's not just around this law, it's around all our laws, that we pass progressive laws, but then we don't invest in the public services, or including local government, to make sure they have the capacity to enforce. But I think, Chair, the bottom line is that we are far too tolerant as a society around the abuse of alcohol, whether it's around domestic violence, gender-based violence, whether it's around drunken driving, etc. And I think, Chair, we saw during COVID-19, when the state took very harsh actions, there was immediate positive response. We're not saying we must go back to that kind of regime is not sustainable. There is a space in society for responsible consumption of liquor. Ms. COSATU, we have members in the liquor value chain, from the farms to the retail, manufacturing, bottling, etc. And there's no problem with that, but we need to find the right relationship with alcohol. And currently our relationship is not a good one. Chair, to Honorable Khai's questions, yes, the bill came to NEDLAC. We had engaged on it extensively in NEDLAC. And I, without speaking for government, I recall there was a CS done for this bill. And I think it was tabled at the National Assembly as well. That's my recollection. Chair, the last issue on the issue of the abuse of blue lights. So I think we welcome the kind of provisions in the bill around the issue of emergency vehicles and so forth. And look, the reality is we have private security, significant industry. We also have private ambulance or medical emergency vehicles as well, which are also growing quite significantly. So obviously ambulances, be it public or private, would need to have the emergency lights. And I think the regulations can provide for that kind of, how it can be done, etc. But I think, Chair, Honorable Alont is right about the abuse of the emergency lights. We have seen many people who have nothing to do with emergency vehicles having these lights. So I think there is a need to deal with those manufacturers and to deal with those persons. I think, just lastly, I don't want to get into trouble with my comrades, but I think if I can recall correctly, in 2009 in the Western Cape, after the elections, the provincial government took a stance to remove the blue lights from the vehicles for MECs. Perhaps one doesn't need to go to that extreme, but I think the intention was correct of the provincial government to say that when VIP protection officers are transporting political office bearers, be it national, provincial, whomever, that does not constitute an emergency. And should not be utilized, etc. So I think, Chair, that's why we've said let's have some additional subclause to say the transporting of political office bearers does not constitute an emergency unless there's a threat to life, etc. But yeah, I think that's the question, Chair. I think just to thank members for the positive comments, and we're hopeful that we could find some sort of a compromise to reinsert some sort of a clause 46. Perhaps along the lines that the MRC has proposed, which we really felt are very helpful, Chairperson members. Thank you.
Thank you.